The day my neighbor asked me for a life-changing favor was one of the craziest yet most exciting days of my life. It was a warm, quiet afternoon. I had just settled into my usual spot on the porch, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, when I first noticed Alan, my neighbor of 3 years. He was crouched beside his garden, a pair of gloves clutched in one hand and a spade in the other. His posture was tense, his broad shoulders hunched, as though the act of gardening had somehow become a burden instead of the usual solace he seemed to find in it. Alan and I weren't exactly close, but we had the kind of relationship you'd expect from neighbors who shared a stretch of suburbia. We exchanged waves, talked about the weather, and occasionally made small talk about the state of our lawns. He'd offered to help me fix a broken gutter once, and in return, I'd helped him move a stubborn piece of furniture into his garage. That was the extent of it, until now. He stood abruptly, brushing dirt off his hands as his gaze drifted toward my house. For a moment, he hesitated, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as though deciding whether or not to approach. Then, with a deep breath, he began making his way across the lawn, each step slow and deliberate. "Hey, Ryan," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the late afternoon stillness. "Got a minute?" I set my glass down on the small table beside me, already sensing that this wasn't going to be another casual chat about the neighborhood. "Sure," I replied, gesturing to the empty chair next to me. "What's up?" Alan climbed the steps and sat down heavily, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared out at the street. Up close, he looked different, tired almost, vulnerable in a way that didn't match the confident, easygoing demeanor he usually projected. "I need your help," he said finally, his voice low. He didn't look at me as he spoke, his focus fixed on a distant point beyond the neatly trimmed hedges. And I wouldn't ask if I didn't really mean it. His words caught me off guard. Alan didn't strike me as the kind of person who needed help from anyone, let alone me. He was one of those people who always seemed self-assured, the kind of guy who could figure things out on his own. "Of course," I said after a moment, leaning forward slightly. "What do you need?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, but it's also personal, and I need someone I can trust." The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and unspoken. I could feel the tension radiating off him, the kind of tension that came from holding something inside for too long. Whatever this was, it wasn't easy for him to talk about. "You can trust me," I said, my voice steady. "Whatever it is, I'll do what I can to help." For the first time since he'd sat down, Alan turned to look at me. There was something in his eyes, an uncertainty almost, like he was searching for reassurance before he took the plunge. "Do you have time to talk now?" he asked. I nodded. "Take your time. I'm all ears." He nodded back, though his posture remained rigid. For a while, he didn't speak, his jaw working as though he was trying to find the right words. The silence stretched, but I didn't push him. Sometimes people needed space to figure out what they wanted to say, and I was willing to wait. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests, as he exhaled deeply. "Okay," he said, almost to himself. "Let me just start from the beginning." Alan began talking, his voice measured at first, like he was testing the waters. He spoke about his job, how it had been demanding lately, with long hours and the kind of stress that crept into his personal life. He talked about his sister, Laura, and her 2 kids, who'd been struggling since her divorce last year. And then finally, he got to the heart of it. "I've been trying to help her as much as I can," he said, his voice quieter now, "but it's hard. She doesn't want to accept help from me, at least not the way she probably needs to, and I'm worried about the boys. They're at an age where this kind of stuff really sticks with you, you know?" I nodded, understanding where he was coming from. "It's tough," I said. "Kids are resilient, but they still need stability." "That's exactly it," Alan said, his tone growing more animated. "And I think they could use someone steady, someone who knows how to navigate tough situations." He paused, glancing at me as though gauging my reaction. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk to her," he said. "You've always struck me as someone who's good at understanding people, at listening without judgment. I think she could really use that right now." The request caught me off guard. I'd expected something practical, like borrowing a tool or helping him with a project. Not this, but as I thought about it, I realized how much it meant that Alan would ask me for something so personal. And the craziest part was that this wasn't his last request. "I'd be happy to," I said, my voice firm. "If you think it'll help, I'll do whatever I can." Relief flashed across Alan's face, softening the tension that had been etched into his features. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." He smiled then, a small, genuine smile that seemed to lighten the air around us. "You're a good neighbor, Ryan," he said. "Better than I deserve." "Hey, we're all just doing our best," I said with a shrug. "And you've always been there for me when I needed it." Alan chuckled softly, the sound carrying a hint of warmth that hadn't been there before. "Well, I guess that makes us even." The conversation shifted after that, flowing into easier topics as the tension between us eased. But even as we talked about the garden or the weather, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something bigger, not just for Alan and his sister, but for us as well. When he finally stood to leave, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. "Thanks again," he said, his tone sincere. "I'll let you know when I've talked to Laura." "Anytime," I replied, watching as he made his way back to his house. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, leaving the night still and silent once more. As I sat there, the cool evening air settling around me, I couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. Alan's favor might have seemed small on the surface, but something told me it was just the beginning of a much larger story, one I was about to step into, whether I was ready for it or not. But the story definitely didn't end there. It had only started, because the next morning, I woke up with Alan's request still lingering in my mind. It wasn't just the weight of what he'd asked, it was the way he'd asked it, the vulnerability in his voice that made it impossible to say no. As I went about my day, I couldn't help but replay our conversation in my head, trying to piece together what had led him to reach out to me. By mid-afternoon, I decided to take a break from my usual routine and head outside. The weather was perfect, warm with a light breeze that carried the faint scent of blooming flowers. I found myself on the porch again, my usual spot, sipping on a glass of lemonade as I watched the world pass by. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was comforting, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Alan and his sister. I hadn't heard from him yet, but I figured he was probably working up the nerve to talk to Laura. It couldn't have been easy for him, asking for help, let alone explaining to his sister that he thought she needed it. Still, I hoped he'd follow through. The idea of meeting her, of possibly making a difference in her life, felt oddly significant. Just as I was lost in thought, the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk pulled me back to the present. I glanced up to see Alan approaching, his expression unreadable, but his pace purposeful. He raised a hand in greeting, and I gestured for him to come up onto the porch. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying a mix of hesitation and resolve. "Got a minute?" "Always," I replied, setting my glass down. "What's going on?" He took a seat beside me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I talked to Laura," he said after a moment, his tone cautious. "She wasn't thrilled at first, but I think she's open to the idea. She said she'd meet with you." "That's great," I said, genuinely relieved. "When does she want to do it?" "She's free tomorrow afternoon," he said. "Would that work for you?" I nodded. "Absolutely. Just tell me where and when." Alan offered a small smile, though his posture remained tense. "Thanks, Ryan, really. I don't know how to repay you for this." "You don't need to," I said, brushing off his concern. "I'm happy to help." He nodded, but I could see the weight of the situation still pressing on him. "I'll text you the details," he said, standing up. "I should probably get going, but thanks again." As he walked back to his house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation building inside me. Tomorrow I'd meet Laura, and hopefully I'd be able to help her in some small way. But more than that, I felt a deepening connection to Alan, one that went beyond neighborly kindness. Then the next day arrived quickly, and I found myself standing outside a small coffee shop scanning the crowd for Laura. Alan had described her as petite, with dark hair and a kind smile, and it didn't take long for me to spot her. She was sitting at a corner table by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as she stared out at the street. "Laura?" I asked as I approached, offering a tentative smile. She looked up, her expression guarded but polite. "You must be Ryan," she said, standing to shake my hand. "Alan told me a lot about you." "Hopefully all good things," I said lightly, taking a seat across from her. She smiled faintly, though her eyes remained cautious. "Mostly." There was a brief, awkward silence as we both tried to figure out how to start. Finally, I decided to take the plunge. "Alan mentioned you've been going through a tough time," I said gently. "I just want you to know, I'm here to listen, no judgment." Laura's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she let out a small sigh. "I appreciate that," she said. It's been a lot. The divorce, trying to keep things stable for the boys, figuring out what comes next. Sometimes it feels like it's too much." I nodded, letting her words sink in before responding. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot on your own," I said, "but you don't have to. It's okay to lean on people, even if it's just for a little while. Her eyes softened, and I could see the walls she'd built around herself starting to come down. Alan means well, she said after a moment, but sometimes he doesn't know how to help without making it feel like I'm failing. I get that, I said. He cares about you, but he doesn't always know the right way to show it. That's where I come in, I guess, to remind you that accepting help doesn't mean you're weak, it just means you're human. For the next hour, we talked. Laura opened up about her struggles, her fears, and her hopes for the future. She spoke about her boys, how they were adjusting, what they needed, and how hard it was to feel like she was enough for them. I listened, offering encouragement where I could, but mostly just letting her speak. By the time we finished, she looked lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." "Any time," I said. "Really, you're not alone in this, Laura." She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. I'll try to remember that. As I left the coffee shop, I felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond words. Helping Laura had been more fulfilling than I'd expected, and it made me realize just how much I valued the connections I was building with her and with Alan. I was curious what Alan's reaction would be to the fact that I had fulfilled his request. That evening, Alan stopped by again, his expression a mix of curiosity and hope. "How'd it go?" he asked as soon as I opened the door. "It went well," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "She's amazing, Alan, stronger than she gives herself credit for." Relief washed over his face, and he let out a deep breath. "I can't thank you enough," he said. "I knew she'd open up to you." "She's lucky to have you," I said, "and so am I." Alan looked at me then, his gaze lingering in a way that made my chest tighten. There was something unspoken between us, something that had been building since the moment he knocked on my door that first afternoon. And as the silence stretched, I realized I didn't want to ignore it any longer. Alan lingered in the doorway. His expression caught somewhere between gratitude and hesitation. His presence filled the space with an unspoken tension that was hard to ignore. I stepped back, gesturing for him to come further inside, and he took a cautious step forward, his gaze never quite meeting mine. "You've done so much already," he began, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to take up more of your time." "You're not," I replied firmly. "You're welcome here any time, Alan. You know that." He offered a faint smile, but his posture remained stiff, as though he was holding something back. "It's just, I didn't expect this to go so well. Laura seemed lighter when I talked to her earlier, and I know that's because of you." "She's doing the hard work," I said, brushing off his praise. "I just gave her a space to breathe." Alan nodded, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Still, it means a lot to both of us." We stood there for a moment, the air between us heavy with something unspoken. Finally, I decided to break the silence. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, heading toward the kitchen. "Coffee? Tea? Maybe something stronger?" "Water's fine," he said, following me into the kitchen. As I filled the glass, I felt his gaze on me, steady and intent. When I turned back to hand it to him, our fingers brushed, and the contact sent a small jolt through me. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. "Ryan," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, leaning back against the counter. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Why did you say yes to helping Laura? I mean, you didn't have to, but you did. Why?" The question caught me off guard, and I took a moment to gather my thoughts. "Because you asked," I said simply, "and because I could see how much it meant to you helping her, and you felt like the right thing to do." Alan studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're a good man, Ryan," he said finally. "Better than I think you realize." I felt my cheeks warm under his gaze, and I looked away, focusing on the glass in his hand. "I just try to do what I can," I said, my voice softer now. "You do more than that," he said, stepping closer. "You make people feel seen, heard. That's rare." I looked up at him then, meeting his gaze head on. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of vulnerability and intensity that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure what to say, so I stayed silent, letting the moment stretch between us. Finally, Alan broke the tension with a small laugh, stepping back and shaking his head. "Sorry," he said, his tone lighter now. "I didn't mean to get all serious on you." "It's okay," I said, smiling to ease his embarrassment. "Sometimes serious is good." He nodded, finishing his water and setting the glass down on the counter. "I should probably get going," he said, though his reluctance was clear. "Thanks again, Ryan, for everything." "Any time," I said, walking him to the door. You know where to find me." Alan nodded with a smile. "Oh yes, I know, and I will," he said. As he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. His words, his gaze, the way he'd lingered it all, felt loaded with a meaning I couldn't quite name. And as I closed the door behind him, I realized I didn't want to ignore it any longer. Something crazy was going to happen. The next few days passed in a blur, but Alan was never far from my thoughts. I found myself replaying our conversations, analyzing every glance, every word, searching for clues to what he might be feeling. It was maddening, but it was also exhilarating, a reminder that life still held surprises, even when you least expected them. It wasn't long before Alan showed up again, this time in the early evening. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood as he stood on my porch, looking uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "Hey," I said, opening the door. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he said quickly, though his tone lacked conviction. I needed to get out of the house. Mind if I join you for a bit?" "Not at all," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He followed me into the living room, and we settled onto the couch, the atmosphere between us charged but comfortable. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular. The weather, work, the latest neighborhood gossip. But there was an undercurrent to the conversation, a tension that neither of us seemed willing to address. Finally, Alan leaned back, letting out a deep sigh. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about not having to do everything alone." "And?" I prompted, my heart pounding in anticipation. "And I think you're right," he admitted. "But it's hard, letting someone in, letting them see the parts of you that aren't perfect." "Alan," I said gently, turning to face him, "you don't have to be perfect, no one does." Sometimes the best connections come from showing the messy, vulnerable parts of ourselves. He looked at me then, his expression open, but hesitant. "That's easier said than done," he said softly. "I know," I said, "but I'm here, if you're ready to try." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. But then, slowly, he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, Ryan," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "That means more than you know." As the evening wore on, the tension between us began to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding that felt more profound than words could express. We didn't need to say anything else. The connection we shared spoke volumes on its own, and as I sat there listening to Alan's voice and watching the way his eyes lit up when he spoke, I realized that this was only the beginning of something far greater than either of us had imagined. Then the next morning, I found myself reflecting on the quiet moments Alan and I had shared the night before, the way his voice softened when he spoke about his struggles, the way his eyes searched mine as though looking for reassurance. It all stayed with me, lingering in the corners of my mind as I went about my day. By mid-afternoon, I was tending to my garden when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. I turned to see Alan standing at the edge of my yard, his hands tucked into his pockets and a tentative smile on his face. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his tone light, but carrying a hint of uncertainty. "Not at all," I replied, wiping my hands on a nearby towel. "What brings you by?" He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "I figured I owed you a proper thank you for everything you've done for Laura and for me." "There's no need for that," I said, brushing off his gratitude. "I'm happy to help." "I know," he said, his voice softening, "but I still wanted to. I was wondering if you'd let me cook you dinner tonight, my way of showing my appreciation." The offer caught me off guard, but the sincerity in his expression made it impossible to refuse. "I'd like that," I said, smiling. "Great," he said, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "How about 7 p.m., my place?" "Perfect," I replied, my heart already racing at the thought. That evening, I found myself standing outside Alan's door, a bottle of wine in hand and a nervous energy buzzing through me. I wasn't sure why I felt this way. After all, it was just dinner. But there was an unspoken weight to the evening that I couldn't ignore. Alan greeted me with a warm smile, ushering me inside. The aroma of garlic and herbs filled the air, and I couldn't help but be impressed by the effort he'd put into the meal. The table was set with care, a small vase of fresh flowers adding a touch of elegance to the simple setup. "You went all out," I said, handing him the wine. "I wanted to make it special," he admitted, pouring us each a glass. "You deserve that." His words sent a warmth through me, and I found myself relaxing as we sat down to eat. The food was delicious, but it was the conversation that truly made the evening memorable. Alan opened up in a way he hadn't before, sharing stories from his childhood, his dreams, and even his regrets. "It's funny," he said at one point, swirling the wine in his glass. "I always thought I had everything figured out, but lately it feels like I'm still trying to figure out who I am." "That's not a bad thing," I said, meeting his gaze. "Sometimes the journey is more important than the destination." He smiled at that, his eyes holding mine for a beat longer than necessary. "You always know the right thing to say," he said softly. "It's easy when it's the truth," I replied. The atmosphere between us shifted then, the air growing heavier with something unspoken. Alan leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative as he studied me. "Ryan," he began, his voice low, "there's something I've been wanting to say." "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. He hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "I've been holding back," he admitted, "for a long time. I've been afraid to let anyone get too close, but with you, it feels different." "Different how?" I prompted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Like I can be myself," he said simply. "Like I don't have to hide." His honesty took my breath away, and for a moment all I could do was stare at him, my mind racing with emotions I hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. "You don't have to hide with me," I said finally, my voice steadied despite the whirlwind inside me. "I see you, Alan, and I'm not going anywhere." His expression softened, and he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "for everything." After dinner, we moved to the couch, our conversation flowing as easily as ever. But there was a new depth to it now, a sense of vulnerability that made every word feel significant. Alan shared more about his fears, his hopes, and the moments that had shaped him, and I found myself drawn to him in a way I hadn't anticipated. At one point, he paused, his gaze drifting to the window where the moonlight cast a soft glow. "You've made me realize something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's that?" I asked, leaning closer. "That it's okay to want more," he said, turning back to me, to let myself feel again. His words sent a shiver through me, and I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You deserve that," I said softly. "You deserve to be happy." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and longing. "So do you," he said, his voice steady. "And I think we can find that together." The weight of his words settled over me, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us. Slowly, hesitantly, I leaned in, my heart pounding in my chest. Alan met me halfway, and when our lips finally met, it was like the world had shifted into focus. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, a flood of emotion spilling over as we let go of the walls we'd both been holding up for so long. His hands found their way to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into the warmth of his embrace. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads resting against each other, I couldn't help but smile. "That felt right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It did," he agreed, his smile mirroring mine, more than I ever expected. "Now let me thank you for fulfilling my request," he said, with a slight smile on his face. I could see in his eyes what he was about to do. We both had felt it, and the tension snapped. He slowly went down and did the thing. This was crazy. This was amazing. I can't describe the feeling. When I finished, I could see he had enjoyed it as well. And as the night wore on, we stayed curled up on the couch, the quiet intimacy between us speaking volumes. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that no matter what came next, we would face it together. The night felt infinite, the kind of evening where time seemed to bend and stretch, wrapping around the two of us like a warm cocoon. Alan's hand rested lightly on mine as we sat on the couch, our shared silence speaking louder than any words could. The kiss had shifted something between us, a quiet yet powerful acknowledgement of the connection we both felt, but had been hesitant to name. "I didn't think this would happen," Alan murmured, his voice soft as though he was afraid to disturb the moment. "Neither did I admitted, my gaze locked on his. "But it feels like it was meant to." He smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that made my chest tighten. "I've spent so long putting everyone else first," he said, his thumb brushing gently against the back of my hand. "I didn't think I'd ever find someone who made me feel like I could be more than just the guy who holds everything together." "You don't have to do that with me," I said, my voice firm despite the lump forming in my throat. "You can just be yourself." Alan's eyes softened, and he nodded, his fingers tightening around mine. "I want that," he said quietly, "with you." The following days were filled with a newfound lightness, a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. Alan and I began spending even more time together, our conversations growing deeper as we explored the uncharted territory of this connection between us. It was as though the walls we'd both built around ourselves were finally crumbling, leaving us free to truly see each other. One evening, as we sat on his porch watching the sunset, Alan turned to me with a contemplative look in his eyes. "You know," he began, his tone tinged with hesitation, "I've been thinking about what you said the other night." "Which part?" I asked, leaning closer. "About deserving happiness," he said, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I've always believed that happiness was something you earned, by doing the right thing, by being responsible, but maybe it's not that complicated. Maybe it's just about letting yourself feel it when it comes." "That's exactly what it is," I said, my voice gentle. "Happiness doesn't have to be something you work for. It can just be." He looked at me then, his expression filled with a quiet determination. "You make me want to believe that," he said softly. "You make me want to let go of all the reasons I've told myself I couldn't have this." "You can," I said, reaching out to take his hand, "and you don't have to do it alone." The weight of my words seemed to settle over him, and he nodded, a small but significant shift in his posture. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "for believing in me." As our relationship deepened, so did the challenges we faced. Alan's hesitation to fully embrace what we had was understandable, given his history of putting others before himself, but as we navigated those moments of doubt together, I found myself growing even more certain that what we shared was worth fighting for. One evening, as we prepared dinner in his kitchen, Alan turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his tone tentative. "Anything," I replied, setting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables. He hesitated for a moment before meeting my gaze. "Do you ever think about where this is going? About us?" "All the time," I said honestly, "and I think it's going somewhere incredible." A smile tugged at his lips, but there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I want that too," he said, "but it scares me, Ryan. I've spent so long convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that I could handle everything on my own. Letting you in, it's not easy." "I know," I said, stepping closer and placing a hand on his arm, "but you don't have to have it all figured out right now. We can take it one step at a time." Alan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing under my touch. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is," I said with a small smile. "Sometimes we're the ones who make things more complicated than they need to be." His laughter was soft but genuine, and he nodded. "You might be right about that." As the night wore on, we found ourselves once again curled up on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the room. Alan's arm draped over my shoulders, and I leaned into him, my head resting against his chest. It was a simple moment, but it felt profound, a quiet reminder of how far we'd come and how much further we could go together. "Thank you," Alan said suddenly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" I asked, tilting my head to look up at him. "For showing me that it's okay to want more," he said, his gaze steady, "and for being patient with me while I figure out how to let myself have it." "You don't have to thank me for that," I said, my voice soft. "I'm just glad I get to be here with you." His smile was small but radiant, and he leaned down to press a gentle kiss to my forehead. "You're something else, Ryan," he said, his voice filled with affection. "So are you," I replied, my heart swelling with emotion. As the minutes turned into hours, we stayed there, wrapped in each other's warmth and the quiet comfort of knowing that we were exactly where we were meant to be. It was the kind of moment that didn't need words, the kind of moment that spoke for itself, and as I drifted off to sleep in his arms, I knew that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. Something that neither of us had expected, but both of us had desperately needed. What do you think of my story? Let me know in the comments.